We've been riding the Bajaj Freedom for a couple of days now, and I can tell you that no other motorcycle that I've ridden in a long time has attracted this much attention. It seems like everybody is fascinated by how this gas-powered motorcycle works. So in today's video, we're going to try and answer all of the questions that you might have. And I think a good place to start is, why do a CNG motorcycle at all? Well, there are two answers to that. The first is obvious. CNG is a more affordable fuel to run than petrol. There are some big cost savings that Bajaj is claiming. We'll get back to that in a bit to see if those numbers are actually accurate. The second benefit is that CNG also burns cleaner than petrol, so you're looking at lower emissions as well. Now, obviously, getting all of this to work in a compact vehicle like a motorcycle has been really hard, and that's why no one has done it so far. Bajaj is the first manufacturer worldwide to create a production CNG bike. So let's talk about how they've managed that. To do so, they literally had to start with a blank piece of paper. New engine, new chassis. The engine is a sloper unit like you'd see in all those old Hero Honda motorcycles, and the idea behind that is to create space for the packaging of the CNG system. Now, CNG is a dry fuel, it's not wet like petrol, and it burns much hotter than petrol. So that means that engines running CNG tend to have a lower life if they weren't designed to run CNG in the first place. Bajaj has built this engine from the ground up. It has bigger oil cooling jets for the piston, it has bigger fins, multiple things in there to help the engine last longer, and Bajaj tells us that this motor will last as long as any other commuter engine that they sell. The second and much more interesting point is the chassis. Now, you don't have a trellis frame here just for style. This is a very functional element, and the challenge here was that if Bajaj used a traditional diamond chassis like you'd see on pretty much any commuter motorcycle, the CNG tank would have to fit on top of the chassis, and that would mean a really high seat height. What they needed was a chassis that was a perimeter chassis where everything could fit in the middle of the chassis. Now, Bajaj does have a perimeter frame. They have one in the NS family, but that's a steel perimeter frame and it is quite heavy. This is a heavy motorcycle because it has a heavy CNG tank, so weight is a critical issue, and that's why Bajaj designed an all-new steel trellis frame, because it's lighter. The other aspect of the chassis is that there's a linked monoshock in the back, and that's another thing that you will not usually see in cost-effective motorcycles like this. So Bajaj really had to engineer this thing from the ground up to make it work. So that's how the system is designed to work. But now let's get to the second big question that everyone's asking us. And some of these are serious questions and some of them are hilarious jokes online. The question is, how safe is this? And it's a valid question because underneath this long seat is a massive gas tank. Right, so Bajaj tells us that they've put this motorcycle through 11 different safety tests, and many of these tests are what you would normally see with cars. Motorcycles don't go through crash tests, but this one has multiple crash tests, impact tests at 60 kilometers an hour, impact tests from the side, pendulum crash tests, and they even drove an 11-ton truck over this, which you've probably seen on social media by now. They say that they are very confident in the safety of the system, and I don't really have a problem with that because Bajaj has a lot of experience in this field. Let me give you this for example. You have probably sat in a rickshaw at some point in your life, and that rickshaw has probably been a Bajaj rickshaw and it has probably been a CNG rickshaw. Do you know where the CNG tank in a rickshaw lies? Right under the seat that you sit on. CNG has built a good reputation for safety. We don't hear about things going wrong very often. Bajaj is an expert in that field, so I really don't think that safety is something you need to be too worried about. So that's the answer to what was your biggest concern with this motorcycle. Now let's answer what is definitely your biggest question. How cost effective is this bike actually? Efficiency testing, it has proved to be a little tricky because every pump out there seems to have a different level of pressure with which they can put gas into the tank, and the pressure in each pump seems to vary through the day as well. So it's hard to get consistent results. Now on the bike, you have a display out here, a bar graph display that tells you how much gas there is. There's no clear number in terms of kilos or liters. On the side, you have an analog pressure gauge, and that tells you how much pressure there's in the tank, but again, it doesn't tell you exactly how much gas there is in the tank. What we ended up doing was what we do for every other motorcycle. We tank it up, we go out, run a distance, come back and tank up at the same pump. Here's the figures that we got. In the city, 94 kilometers per kilogram of gas, which is really, really impressive. Out on the highway, we rode at a very gentle 60 to 65 kilometers per hour, trying to be as smooth as possible with the idea of seeing how efficient can it really be, and the number was quite shocking, 126 kilometers per kilogram. So in reality, you could get what Bajaj is claiming, which is about 102 kilometers per kg. We also tested the bike in petrol, and those numbers were quite lower, as you would expect. And speaking of petrol, you get even less information about how much fuel is actually in the tank. The 2-liter tank sits about here, but you don't get a level gauge for it. Instead, you just get a petrol lamp that will start blinking if it hits reserve level. I think the important thing to note here is that while there is some variability in how much distance it will cover on CNG depending on how much gas you are able to get in the tank, what is clear is that this thing can be very efficient. Now, if you were to make a basic calculation in terms of running costs, let's assume 94 km per kg in the city versus 65 kpl for a petrol bike in a city, which is a really high number. Very few bikes will actually give you 65 in the city. You will see that the costs are actually half for CNG. And that means that Bajaj's claims are right. You could cut your running costs by half. Cost saving is a game changer, but how much of a sacrifice do you have to make in terms of performance? With less than 10 horsepower and 10 Newton meters of torque, this is one of the least powerful 125s out there, and it is the heaviest of the lot as well. With that considered, it comes as no surprise that performance is not really a strong point. In our tests, the numbers we got were more in line with 100 to 110 cc than 125. That being said, the performance is just fine. This is not a sporty motorcycle, you will not want to ride it like one, but it's quick enough, and that applies for CNG mode. Now, CNG mode, as you can see in the test numbers, is definitely slower than petrol mode, particularly in the lower revs. When you rev it out, you start to get the performance. Nevertheless, I really never felt the need to switch from CNG to petrol. You only feel a bit of a struggle when you're going uphill, maybe over a flyover, especially with a pillion. At that point, you'll want to drop 1 or 2 gears, but that's about it. For most practical purposes, CNG mode is good enough, and you really won't want to switch over to petrol. If you do want to change from petrol to CNG for any reason, it's as simple as flicking this switch. Bajaj says that you can do it on the move, and it does work, although I found that it helps to keep the accelerator closed for about a second or two while you're making the transition, because if you hit the switch and accelerate suddenly, the bike can hesitate. Beyond that, the system really works quite well. Another interesting point is that you can start the engine in CNG mode, and you can exclusively run this bike in CNG mode as well. But there's something that you should know. Bajaj says that periodically, once in a while, the bike will automatically change over to petrol mode, run in petrol mode for a short period, and then go back to CNG mode. They do this to keep the fuel injection system clean, to prevent the injectors from getting gummed up. It's something that happens in the background, but it also means that you must have some petrol in that tank at all times. As you can imagine, there's some very complex engineering that has gone into making all of this work, and to the Freedom's credit, most of the time it is a very smooth experience. Throttle response is very natural, the bike feels very natural to ride, and we don't really have too many complaints. It isn't completely perfect though. One of the issues I found is that when you're riding in traffic and you slow down, the engine tends to keep a pretty high idle RPM, and that means that the bike sort of surges forward into traffic ahead of you. You do need to pull in the clutch and apply the brakes a little bit. This happens in both petrol and CNG mode, and I think maybe Bajaj is trying to have some sort of anti-stall system, or maybe something like TVS's glide-through technology where the bike just pulls itself forward. But it doesn't seem to work very nicely, and it's something I'd like to see improved. We also had a couple of rare instances where you come down to a standstill and the engine stalls. It quickly restarts when you hit the button, but it did happen a couple of times. For the most part though, this is a very natural and normal feeling engine, much like any other commuter bike. And in fact, it actually makes a pretty peppy sound. It's quite nice, and since the internet must know how every bike sounds, here's how this one sounds. Alright, next question. How does this bike ride? Because it is quite unusual in the fact that it has an 18 kilo cylinder sitting quite high up. To its credit, it's really very normal feeling. Everyone we put on this motorcycle would never have told you that it was a CNG bike in the first place, and that even applies to me. You sit on it and it rides like a very normal bike. That being said, at 149 kilos, this thing weighs about as much as a 150cc bike, and it's about 20 kilos more than most 125cc commuters. As a rider, you will be aware of the fact that this is a heavy motorcycle, not as light on its feet as its rivals, but it's not an intimidating or strange behaving bike in any way. It just feels like a normal motorcycle. It never wants to strangely drop into corners. The handling is very neutral, and I think Bajaj's development team deserves huge praise for what they've pulled off here. As far as the riding experience goes, this is very much a standard commuter. There's nothing sporty about this motorcycle. The front brake is quite soft. You need to use the rear to slow it down. It has only combined brakes, which means you can lock up the rear if you press on that pedal a little too hard. The suspension setup is a little strange in that on smooth roads it feels a little on the firm side, but if you hit big bumps, then you feel it's quite soft and it goes through the travel. It basically feels like budget suspension, and that is okay because this is a budget motorcycle. I would classify the suspension comfort as adequate, not terrible, not great. The same goes for the seat comfort. Now this is a very, very long seat. It's almost like you could put a pillow out here and take a nice nap. But in terms of sitting on it, it's a firm seat. Not too bad, but not the most comfortable seat out there. The bigger talking point here though is that this is a tall seat. Because of the placement of that cylinder, the best that Bajaj could do was 825 mm. Now in the world of motorcycles in general, that's not a huge number. It's up there with sporty street naked bikes, but in the world of commuters, this is very high. To give you a demonstration of what this looks like, we're going to call Rishaad in here. Now in previous videos, I've told you that Rishaad owns a Husqvarna 250, but he also owns a Hero Super Splendor. Now at 5'7", you can see that Rishaad is on his tiptoes, and he tells me this is more like the Husqvarna, definitely taller than the Super Splendor, but he also says it's not so difficult to manage, and he thinks he can manage the bike quite well. One of the best things that Bajaj has done for the Freedom is to make sure that it looks interesting and not like a typical boring commuter. There is so much going on with the design of this motorcycle. Right from that unusually shaped headlamp, these chunky fork shrouds, that wide fuel tank, the cladding that you see out here, the long seat that we've talked about, these ADV style mounting points, the trellis frame itself. It's a really interesting motorcycle, and what's going in its favor is that it's a pretty unique looking thing, and that's helping people recognize it out on the street. Very normal looking motorcyclists came up to me and asked, isn't that the Bajaj Freedom? And the fact that they could identify it by name is a really good thing. That being said though, while there are many youthful and modern elements on this bike, Bajaj has kept some things traditional. On the right side, you have a traditional kickstarter, which commuter customers will surely appreciate. On the left side, you have a heel and toe gear shifter. Now there's a funny story about that. When we first rode the bike, all of us reported that the gearbox was randomly jumping out of gear and it wasn't shifting that precisely all the time. Sometimes it would misbehave. But then I realized that it was effectively my heel interacting with the shifter. And when I made sure to use only my toe and keep the rest of my foot out of the way, the gearbox behaved absolutely fine. 3 of us experienced this. It could be down to us, it could be down to the boots that we wear, but it is something we experience and something you should know about. The Freedom is also quite nicely feature loaded for a bike in this segment. There are 3 versions on offer. This is the top bike, and on the top model you get an LED headlamp, a slightly larger LCD display than the other 2 models. That display is Bluetooth compatible, and you have a USB charging port out here. The mid version gives you the LED headlamp, but you don't get the front disc brake. The base version gives you a halogen headlamp and a slimmer rear tire, in addition to the smaller display. The bike also gets a silent start and a side stand engine cut. As for quality levels, things are about what you would expect for this price point. The bike does look nicely put together. There are a few rough plastics and a few panel gaps here and there. It's okay for this price. One thing worth mentioning is that this flap for the fuel filling system is a little flimsy. I would have liked it to be a little better built. Speaking of fuel filling and practicality, this is how it works. You have the CNG filling port on the left and the petrol cap on the right. They're both accessed from here. As for service requirements, this is exactly like Bajaj's other 125cc commuters. A service is scheduled every 5,000 kilometers. The cost should also be very similar. It might be slightly higher because there are a few more filters involved in this process. Speaking of specialized requirements for the CNG system, there are a couple of things you need to know. One, there are some specialized air filters to make sure that the gas is purified before it goes to the engine. These filters need to be cleaned every 10,000 kilometers and replaced every 30,000. The bigger job though is that the CNG tank has to be recertified every 2 years. Bajaj says that their dealerships will assist you with this process. It should take about 2 hours and the cost should be around 1,800 rupees. Clearly, there is a lot to be excited about with this motorcycle, but before we get to the conclusion, let's talk about the drawbacks because there are some. The biggest one, I believe, is the CNG line. Now, CNG pumps have long lines. The CNG network is growing, but as of today, the demand is much higher than the supply. Some of these pumps have just one line for all CNG vehicles, 3-wheelers, 4-wheelers, commercial vehicles, everything. Some of them have different lines for rickshaws and cars, but obviously no one has a separate line yet for a motorcycle, and I think it's going to be quite some time before those unique lines are added because it's going to take some time for quite a few of these bikes to be on the road. The lesson here is that you will have to learn to be patient, and being in a long line that stretches right outside the pump can be difficult if you're in the hot sun or in the pouring rain. Fun story with this motorcycle, there is so much interest right now that people called us forward to cut the line. This was pump attendants and even people standing in the line. Everyone wants to know about it. Everyone is really interested in this motorcycle. But that's only for now, and you shouldn't be planning to cut these lines very often because that interest will very quickly change to irritation. The other issue is at a vehicular level. You've essentially got a tall seat and a fairly heavy motorcycle for the segment. Commuter customers below 5 foot 6 inches may find this to be a problem. That is a fact that is not going to change. I'd also like to touch upon the fact that while this is a fun and youthful looking motorcycle, it really isn't fun to ride in the way we normally expect fun from a bike. It's definitely not going to entertain you like a TVS Raider or the Hero Extreme 125R. But I will also argue that there's a different sort of fun with this motorcycle. Now, I am someone who is mentally conditioned to spending obscene amounts of money on fuel for very fast motorcycles. But even I will admit that there's a special sort of thrill with being able to cover more than 100 kilometers and pay less than 100 rupees. The potential for saving money with this motorcycle is so significant that I think a large number of people will be happily willing to overlook the drawbacks associated with this bike. And the fact that it costs 95,000 to 1.1 lakh rupees only sweetens the deal. I have huge respect for Bajaj for being the first people to come out with this concept, and I'm sure that more manufacturers will join the race. Of course, EVs will still be much cheaper in terms of running costs, but battery technology is not yet at a point where EV motorcycles are convincing enough, and that's where the CNG bike comes in as an affordable alternative to petrol-powered machines. As the name suggests, when compared with EVs, this motorcycle will give you freedom from range anxiety and being tied to a charger. Sales will begin in Maharashtra and Gujarat, and more states will be slowly added. And as far as there are no unforeseen issues that come up when this bike hits the road, I think that the Bajaj Freedom really could be a game changer.